The boring history for sleep, what ancient Carthaginians carved into their boats. Hey guys, tonight we re-unraveling something you probably never thought you'd care about. What ancient Carthaginians carved into their boats? I know, riveting stuff. Literally, there are rivets involved. You're standing right now, metaphorically speaking, on a sun-warmed dock in Carthage, with the salty breeze brushing your skin, and the smell of pine tar and wet rope stuck to the back of your throat. You hear the distant clack of chisels and the murmur of sailors squabbling over whose tunic smells worse. It's loud, chaotic, but just interesting enough to keep you from immediately falling asleep. You squint down the line of docked vessels, long wooden warships, each one narrower than you expect, and long enough to make your ankles hurt just looking at them. Cedar was the gold standard, resistant to rot, lightweight, and sturdy enough to survive a headbutt from Poseidon himself. The atmosphere is tense, but beneath it, layered like the resin between hull seams, is something ancient and intimate. A sense that every beam carries its own story. Their ship designs came from Phoenician roots, but they evolved into something sleeker, more combat-ready. The hulls were double-layered, the decks reinforced. And yet scattered throughout these functional masterpieces were the oddest little carvings, like slanted marks, like slanted T's. A nod to the legendary Carthaginian cavalry? A ship named after a stable animal? Or just a very bored apprentice flexing his artistic chops before being yelled at to swab the deck? Nobody knows. What's clear is that these marks weren't random. They were personal, intentional, often spiritual, but also occasionally ridiculous. Not letters, possibly numbers. You wonder if they kept track of, or slots like airline seat rows. You picture a Carthaginian crewman muttering, I got stuck in CTT again, right by the bilge drain. The Carthaginians didn't just build boats to sail, they built them to outlast, to move grain, troops, elephants, occasionally a grumpy god or two. You stare at it for too long before realizing it has 6 laces and what might be wings. Builders grunt, with thuds. Fire crackles under bubbling resin pots. Someone swears in a dialect you're not even sure was ever written down. It's chaos. But when you sit there for long enough, eyes half-lidded, listening to the gulls and the hammering, you begin to sense the rhythm behind it all. The strange carvings, the careful shaping, the hidden prayers. It's like the shipyard is not just assembling wood and nails, but something bigger. Something haunted by waves and winds and whatever gods haunted the salt air. Mercury's sandals, a sailor's in-joke. Maybe someone just really hated walking barefoot on deck, and many of these carvings were never meant to be seen. But one thing is clear. Every ship they built carried more than cargo or soldiers. It carried meaning. Sometimes hidden. Sometimes sacred. Sometimes shaped like a 6-laced sandal for no good reason at all. Tucked inside beams, underneath benches, even on the interfaces of planks, later hidden by tar. That means someone went out of their way to mark something, knowing it would be buried forever. Like leaving a note in a time capsule you immediately set on fire. On the far end, merchant ships bob lazily, overloaded with inferior fish sauce that probably went bad 2 weeks ago. But what pulls your eyes are the shipbuilders. Their movements are rhythmic, hypnotic. Inside, you spot a peculiar set of carvings, not painted, not etched haphazardly, but inscribed with care. One looks like a stylized fish, curling into a spiral. Another, near the deck beam, resembles a star 5 points, not symmetrical, as if it were drawn by a very tired god with bad geometry skills. You run your hand over them. The wood is soft from sanding, but firm, oiled, and ready. It creaks under your weight like it disapproves of tourists. Chiseling, caulking, muttering, carving. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Some archaeologists claim that many Carthaginian boats bore blessings carved directly into structural beams, literally baking religion into the ship's skeleton. A triangle inside a circle here. A palm branch motif near the mast step. These weren't just doodles. They were protective charms, or maybe invoices. Historians still argue whether these were prayers to deities, reminders of cargo limits, or the ancient equivalent of writing mom on your sword hilt.
Ow.
Let me know where you're re-listening from, and what time it is there in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail behind a man with a mouthful of nails and a limp like he has been kicked by a mule and told to get back to work anyway. He stops by a half-finished galley, pats the hull like it's his sulky child, and starts carving what looks like a tiny spiral near the base of the stern. Not random, not accidental. It's small, but deliberate. Around him, the entire shipyard pulses with labor and a faint sense of religious panic. Carthaginians, after all, weren't just boat people. They were ritual people. You quickly gather that even planks needed to be right before touching the sea. The planks themselves are cedar imported all the way from Lebanon, and you immediately feel poor. Somewhere behind you, someone drops a crate of iron nails and yells something that sounds like Meba Al, curse my spine, which feels like an overreaction, but who are you to judge? You approach a dry-docked bireme, its frame exposed like a skeleton mid-diagnosis. Mainstream historians agree. Carthaginians were precise shipwrights. Their fleets rivaled Rome's for decades, and sometimes surpassed them in quality. Here's where it gets weird. You move closer to a freshly cut rudder, massive and still sticky from pitch. And over there, on the keel of a nearly completed trireme, a small, stylized horse with enormous eyes. One ship has a side beam with what looks like a tiny carved sandal. Amid all these carvings, the noise never stops. The weirdest part? That's how Carthaginians were. Practical, efficient, and deeply superstitious. Or possibly deeply sarcastic. Honestly, you're not sure anymore. You shuffle forward on the dry dock, feeling the splintery wood beneath your soles and the low hum of wind sneaking between the mooring lines. You pass a weathered bireme and step into the shade of a partially tarred merchant ship, her belly open to the air. It's a functional scratch, deliberate, but not showy like someone marking this side up. But in the alphabet of a civilization that no longer exists, you half expect it to hiss at you. It doesn't. It just sits there, worn but defiant. Like it knows something you don't. Historians have debated symbols like this for years. Some think they're prayers for safe travel. Some think they're remarks for inventory like Dante's stack. Amphory past this line, or the ship tips and everyone drowns. You carve your blessing, your fear, your family's name, whatever matters most, to the skeleton of your ship, and then bury it under waterproofing. Trusting the gods to hear you through layers of pine and tar. It's like whispering into a pillow and hoping the wind carries it to Olympus. Practical, others, more romantically inclined, claim these are sailors' marks, private wishes carved into their vessel like love notes to the sea. It's a line of 5 symbols, spaced evenly, almost like a sentence. Others say they're purely decorative, and that we're overthinking ancient doodles. You're not so sure. Spacing is too precise. In the crescent, that shape keeps showing up, again and again, but no Rosetta Stone here, just a mystery, a crescent. A triangle, a tall squiggle, smaller triangle. Almost every ship, military, or merchant seems to bear at least one of these marks, usually inside, sometimes outside. The repetition isn't accidental. Someone made this a habit, a rule. Just 2 dots and a crooked smile scratched under a seat brace, hidden unless you were lying flat on your stomach, staring up. Around you, the shipyard buzzes with quiet tensionmen, hammering, ropes creaking, someone shouting about missing resin. But you're not quite listening anymore. Your focus is on the scratches. The ghosts in the wood, not painted, not labeled, but carved by hand. For them, boat building wasn't just engineering, it was storytelling. You weren't just constructing a machine, you were embedding intent into every inch. It wasn't enough for the boat to float. It had to belong to something, be it a god, a guild, or a grumpy craftsman with back pain. You're not sure if it's a god, a joke, or someone marking their favorite nap spot. It's got the casual charm of a bathroom stall drawing, minus the profanity. It's like the Carthaginians believed ships without these marks weren't just incomplete. They were unlucky, and then something that might be. A bowl? A hat? Certain symbols always appear near certain parts of the ship, just beneath the bow beam, for example, or right at the base of the mast socket. Repetition like that suggests function, not whimsy. Maybe these were guides for future repairs, ceremonial marks to sanctify different zones of the ship. You wouldn't build a kitchen without plumbing. Maybe they wouldn't rig a mast without a fish squiggle under it. Congratulations. You've just cursed your crew to get lost in a fog bank and row in a circle until they start eating the drummer. A severely underfed turtle, but notes about sabotage, espionage, or even smuggling routes. There are scorched patches, faint tool gouges, and a smoother finish where newer planks replace damaged ones. The knowledge that even 2,000 years ago, someone was sneaking their mark into their work. A trace of themselves left behind in something bigger. You've got modern mechanics etching their initials under the hood of a car. Carthaginian shipwrights, same energy, different tools. On the interior, where no paint remains, there's a single letter carved and circled, the Phoenician equivalent of K. Could be a builder's initial, could mean kill-dried, could be someone's version of tagging a wall with Kilroy was here. Carthage was a naval powerhouse, yes, but also a major hub for trade, diplomacy, and occasionally, backdoor dealings. Maybe those odd scratches weren't sacred, they were strategic. But again, historians still argue whether Carthaginian ship carvings were religious charms, technical marks, or literal shipping memos. These aren't just doodles, they're records, messages, safeguards, or, depending on who you ask, wishful thinking etched in wood. That's where you see it. A crude set of lines scratched just beneath the deck planking, like someone's diary entry written in the worst handwriting ever. The carving isn't beautiful, it isn't meant to be. You crouch closer. It's a symbol, looping shape, almost like a sideways S with two dots on either end. And honestly, they might all be right. The Carthaginians didn't leave behind instruction manuals for their boat graffiti. These marks found most often on internal timbers. It's just above the waterline were quiet little rituals. Personal, maybe sacred, maybe just habits, maybe both. You lean against the hull and squint along the grain of the wood, spotting more symbols. A rough starburst, a tiny fork, a fish. If the fish had been drawn by someone who had never seen a fish, these tiny images are carved right before the final pitch seal goes on, never to be seen again, lest the boat sinks, of course, which feels a little counterproductive if you're praying for safe travels. Still, that was the gamble, wasn't it? One fringe theory you overheard from a suspiciously wide-eyed dockside local. These carvings were codes passed between shipwrights, not prayers, not inventory. You trail your fingers over a different section, no darker wood, older grain. The ship's seen action, and there's something strangely comforting about that. On a different boat long abandoned and partially collapsed, you find what may be the closest thing to a message. Some scholars believe symbols like these were part of a non-verbal code, a way for shipwrights to coordinate construction without relying on literacy. You pull back and glance around the docks. Imagine that. You spend months building a war galley, lining up her benches, reinforcing the ribs. Sealing it with pitch hand, you forget to scratch in a little fish symbol near the stern. One especially quirky carving catches your eye. It's a little face. This was all normal, at least for them. Carthaginians didn't divide spiritual from structural, and the more you look, the more you find. Patterns, recurrences. You lean back, eyes heavy, mind floating in cedar-scented daydreams. Permanent, hidden, patient, they're waiting to be noticed. And tonight, you're the one tracing their stories. You blink slowly under the gentle hum of the shipyard, lulled by the hypnotic rhythm of hammers, waves, and a particularly persistent seagull screaming at a discarded eel. You let your hand trail along the edge of another dry-docked ship, feeling the grainy texture of sun-warmed wood, until your palm bumps into something raised, sharp-edged, carved with intention. It's an eye, big, bold, painted. Once traces of red still cling to the carved edge like dried blood from a tomato someone forgot to clean up. Yes. It stares outward from the prow of the vessel, fixed in a permanent expression of Carthaginian ships. Especially war galleys were often fitted with these carved eyes on the prow. A spiritual guidance system. After all, the sea was unpredictable. You could get lost in fog, wind, or just in your own extremely poor navigational skills. In all-seeing, I gave the boat a form of vision, a soul, even. It's like a sentient sea taxi with a divine GPS. A few classicists think the eye was there to terrify enemies. One scholar, probably shunned at academic dinners, has suggested that the eyes were actually coded indicators for ship type or fleet division. Its eye is carved deeper than most, and there are faint scratch marks running across it, probably not battle damage. More like someone tried to change it, redesign it, maybe personalize it, like ancient naval license plates. See two red-eyed triremes. That's the Western Fleet. Blue eye with spirals. Merchant convoy? Three-eyed boat? Okay, that one's probably cursed. Imagine facing down a massive trireme with 30 oars per side and a giant eye glaring at you like it just watched you eat the last olive. You might hesitate. You might rethink your life. You might just stare back and scream, hoping that wins the psychological warfare. Historians generally agree on that much. The debate. What exactly those eyes were for. Around the eye etched lightly are what appear to be eyelashes. But they're geometric, evenly spaced triangles, not actual lashes. One very dry, very serious researcher once suggested these carvings helped oarsmen line up their strokes visually, a kind of rudimentary alignment tool. He's been politely ignored by most of the academic community ever since. Some kind of symbolic enhancement? Just bored geometry enthusiasts? You wish you knew? But like so many other things here, the meaning has been quietly erased by time, tide, and enough tar to suffocate a library. They weren't decorative frills. They were living symbols, watched over, touched up, maybe even prayed to. If you think of the ship as a body, then this was its gaze. And in Carthaginian cosmology, sight was power. Seeing meant protecting, observing, controlling, warning, protection, unblinking confusion. Hard to say. The stylistic choices are dramatic. The pupil is almond-shaped, framed in thick lines. There are signs they were repainted, even recarved, during the ship's service life. Fading lines get retraced, colors get reapplied. Some shipwrecks have layers of pigment still clinging to their eye sockets, like ancient mascara after a shipwreck prom. But the consistency across regions from North Africa to Sicily's jests. The symbol held some kind of pan-Carthaginian significance. You think of the people who carved it, repainted it, stared at it during storms, or maybe kissed it before battle. And for a moment, the eye doesn't just see you feel like it remembers. And deliberately angled toward the sea, as if it's watching something just under the waves. You half expect it to blink, to be remembered, to come back. Others seem almost curious. One even looks like it's mid-wink, though that might just be warping from water damage. Or maybe it was meant to intimidate from both sides, like a wooden Medusa. Or maybe symmetry just made them feel better. Still, it makes you wonder if sailors competed for the best eye design. You picture a group of shipwrights arguing over eye size like it's a high-stakes beauty contest. This isn't an isolated case. As you meander through the shipyard, eye carvings start showing up like they're following you. One ship, then another, then another. Some are engraved directly into the wood, others outlined in iron nails, some surrounded by curling motifs like flames or feathers. It gets a little unsettling, honestly. Like a fleet of floating eyeballs, each judging your outfit. An apotropaic symbol like the evil eyes found throughout the Mediterranean. It's meant to ward off misfortune, hexes, or that one sailor who always brought bad weather and bad jokes. The eye in this view didn't just sit scared off what it saw. Sea monsters, enemy navies, orlets, Bionostromen, tax collectors. And no, you're not imagining things. Some believe they were meant to help the ship see where it was going. Others argue the eye was a form of protection. Of course, some theories are a little less magical. And then there's the fringe camp. You pause near a particularly battered war galley, one that looks like it's seen both storms and arguments with dockworkers. A bored sailor with a chisel and too much time. A fleet commander's superstition? A ritual, repeated by generations. Historians still argue whether Carthaginian eyes were standardized military features, localized religious icons, or just trendy ancient emojis. And you can't help but notice how stylized the eyes are. They're not just ovals with dots. They're expressive. Some look fierce. Even weirder, sometimes there are two eyes, one on each side of the prow, as if the ship needed stereo vision. You step closer to one of these double-eyed ships and notice another curious detail. And of course there's the ever-practical idea that maybe, just maybe, the eye was a navigation aid. The best part? These eyes weren't just carved once and forgotten. That means sailors, or maybe their spiritual advisors, maintained these eyes. It's not hard to imagine a sailor pausing before a voyage, pressing fingers to the carved eye on the prow, whispering a plea to be seen. And so here you are thousands of years later, doing the same thing. It's touching that same wood, tracing that same outline. The heat has softened a little now. the sun tilting westward as long shadows stretch across the shipyard. You follow one down the dock and up a weathered gangplank, careful not to trip over the fraying rope coiled like a sleeping snake. This ship's leaker, older, feels different, less patched, more deliberate. Just the quiet permanence of someone pressing their presence into wood and walking away. You remember hearing once that some believed ships were not tools, but beings, extensions of their makers, half spirit, half machine. The first time they touched water, just like a child's first breath, was considered a moment of transformation. Place your palm over it and something shivers behind your ribcage. It's silly, you know that, but it's also not. Because this wasn't just an accident. Before a ship was launched, especially a military vessel, it underwent purification. Her symbol shows up everywhere: temples, urns, jewelry, and yes, on ships, especially during launch rites. Sometimes the mark was carved into the hull, sometimes burned into a hidden board. See it again, this time near the stern, more stylized, almost floral. Like someone had time to make it elegant. A symbolic stand-in for the sailor's feet to trick the gods into protecting the idea of him. Even if he didn't survive the journey. Another theory suggests the shoes belonged to a shipwright who died before the launch, and the crew sealed them on board to honor his contribution. The more skeptical among the academic world say this is probably just a weird accident, a lost pair, a misstep during repairs. You find one now, etched in faint letters across the inner gunnel. Shamat Bal, the joy of Bal, religious name, invoking the storm god. Not uncommon. Other ship names were more poetic: Seabird, Daughter of Waves, Silent Arrow. There's evidence of sailors reblessing a ship at every port, not just once, not just at launch. Continuously etched into the wood, not functional, just a design. A rectangle, 2 hinges, and what looks like a handle, no bigger than your hand. No context, no labels. The idea being that a ship, like a person, needs regular attention. Reminders of who she is, why she floats, and who's watching over her, kind of like affirmations, but with less yoga and more barnacles. Some say you have to give them a place to rest, a doorway, a token, a mark so they can travel with you and not get angry. Superstition? Absolutely. But also, ... This is Carthage. The line between myth and manual labor was thinner than a ship's ribbing. And a few, if translations are to be trusted, were downright threatening. Vengeance, wind, shatterer, lion of the deep. Subtle Carthage. Real subtle, but really. Perfectly placed sandals preserved for centuries. One sunken wreck recovered near Malta bore a name that puzzled even the most experienced translators. Yebulam Hatarsham, which might mean the drunk scribes. Possibly, the scribes are lost. Or, in one bold guess, made up by a guy who was tired of translating Phoenician. Nobody really knows. Garlands were hung. Incense burned. Sometimes a small animal was sacrificed, usually a bird or a lamb, something humble, something whose death would symbolically protect the crew. Others think it was more fluid. Any ship could bear her mark if the builder requested divine protection and greased the right priest's palm. Not modern ones, ancient, rotting, lashed with twine and cracked leather, or something not quite human. Carefully arranged, left intentionally, almost reverently. Like someone stepped out of them and never came back. A bit of bureaucracy, a bit of superstition, and a healthy dash of we're sailing into a sea filled with pirates, sea monsters, and Roman patrols. So let's not take any chances. They're anchored in place by pitch, hardened into the planking as if sealed in amber. They're part of the ship now. And there's a third theory, mostly dismissed now, that the Tanit symbol was actually a private family crest co-opted later into state religion. You're safe tonight. There's no altar here now, just the lingering silence of old ceremony. Someone made the decision to carve a hand. And when you're standing where they once stood, fingers fitting loosely over their imprint, it feels like you're part of something older than language. And as you duck beneath the canopy of its upper deck, you notice something strange carved into the crossbeam over your head. A handprint. It's not painted, carved. About the size of yours, give or take. 5 fingers, no text. This wasn't decorative. It was symbolic. And the Carthaginians were nothing if not deeply symbolic when it came to their ships. That's what this section of the shipyard is for. Launch rites. The rituals weren't always the same, but many sources agree on the bones of it. You pass under another beam, this one covered in what looks like rows of tiny hash mark scores, counted and then crossed out. Maybe inventory. Maybe a personal tally of how many ships this carpenter had helped birth into the sea. But beneath the scoring, there's something more deliberate. A curved line, almost a crescent, flanked by two upright lines. You've seen it before. That's the symbol for Tanit, the Carthaginians' main goddess protector of the city, guardian of fertility, and, according to some, overseer of safe voyages. But not everyone agrees. Some historians argue that the Tanit symbol was reserved for state ships' war galleys commissioned by the Council of Elders, not everyday cargo boats. You step out toward the bow, where you find something else. A pair of sandals? One fringe interpretation? These shoes were left as a kind of offering. Historians still argue whether Carthaginian launch rituals were universal civic practices, guild traditions, or half-improved folk customs. You'd like to think it was all three. The final step in these rites, naming the ship. Sometimes the name was painted, sometimes carved, often both. But occasionally, you find something stranger. Some names were repainted with each new voyage, others never changed. And just when you think you've seen everything, you notice one final carving, nearly hidden behind a sealed hatch. A tiny door. It looks like someone drew a doorway for a very small person. You pause, suddenly aware of the shadows gathering behind you. Remember a story you heard earlier? A whispered tale about dock spirits. The minor gods are ancestors who dwell in the bones of every ship. So you step back, tip your head respectfully toward the tiny doorway, and walk quietly away, just in case. The dock creaks under your feet as you return to the heart of the shipyard, where ropes dangle like limp vines, and the air smells like brine, beeswax, and slow-burning pitch. Carthage doesn't just build boats, it builds engines. Sleek, muscular bodies meant to split the sea and sometimes each other. No, this is the rostrum of bronze-clad battering spike fitted to the prow of Carthaginian warships, especially the iconic triremes and quadriremes. You run a finger over the green patina metal and feel faint gouges, scars from past encounters. Imagine being on the receiving end of this thing. You probably wouldn't get a chance to imagine much afterward. One camp insists these flourishes were meant to identify squadrons at sea. Another argues they were psychological scare tactics aimed at intimidating enemies, before contact was even made. And yet another thinks they were just leftovers from mold imperfections and smithing habits, likely the shipbuilder, or maybe the captain. Or maybe someone whose name was added after the ram claimed its first victim. Boo. Shipwrights would study dents in the bronze, assess whether impact points needed reshaping. You picture a crew standing on a beach, flipping a 500-pound bronze ram like a pancake, arguing about the angle of entry. If eyes gave the ship vision, the ram gave it teeth. Think of it as Phase 1, stun the enemy ship. Phase 2, grappling hooks, boarding, swordplay. It's like ancient naval MMA, and Carthaginians were known for their flexibility. Somewhere out there, a sailor once stood beside this hunk of bronze, blade in hand, and carved in his own reminder that the sea gives no guarantees. The ram doesn't ask who you are, it just crushes and moves on. They weren't always the most numerous fleet, but they knew how to hit hard, fast, and weird. Sneaky tactics were very on brand. A handful of archaeometallurgical reports mention iron found deep inside bronze molds. Intentional? Maybe a belief that certain metals carried divine force? Could be, or maybe it was just early recycling. But it adds mystery, little electricity to your sleepy stroll. A single word scratched in with a knife. Meat, not Punic, maybe Berber, or a variant of Phoenician. It means death. Or maybe fate. The etymology is unclear, the mood unmistakable. Not quickly, of course. It's not like ancient sailors had IKEA ship parts. The maneuver took timing, coordination, and the rowing equivalent of an Olympic sprint. You step over it, careful not to trip, and wonder how many of these ships never came back. How many of these rams rest at the bottom of the sea, fused to wood, kissed by fish, still dreaming of impact. If you missed too slow, wrong angle, you exposed your own hull and risked getting flanked or boarded. But in certain cases, rams may have been removed and replaced or even displayed after successful battles like trophies. Imagine walking into a Carthaginian naval office and seeing 3 enemy rams hanging on the wall like taxidermied achievements. That one? Oh yeah. That was from the Battle of Drepana. Snapped a Roman quinquarium clean in half. Good times. And it wasn't subtle. You spot one now. Dark, angular, and dented from what must have been a love tap with another boat's spleen. Most have had their rams stripped off, maybe for repairs, or maybe to keep the dock kids from stealing them and building chariots. One of them, though, still bears its weapon. And unlike the ones you've seen so far, this one is engraved. Tiny lines swirl around the base of the ram, creating a maze-like pattern that wraps all the way around. You lean in? A motif? A signature? Tonight, you turn your gaze away from the divine carvings and launch day poetry to something grittier, grumpier. You're here for the ram. In Carthage, a warship was a weapon, but a named weapon, a vessel with a history. Every successful ramming built prestige. There are clay tablets that reference fleets not by number, but by kill count. Ships that sank 3 Roman vessels might get rechristened or elevated in a battle hymn, think ancient Top Gun, but with fewer aviator sunglasses and more sea splinters. In some cases, forged separately and welded into ship frames, then riveted, braced, and sealed with bitumen and gods know what's else. The front was often triple-pronged, like Poseidon's salad fork, giving it the ability to both puncture and wedge into enemy holes. Think of it like medieval dentistry, but for wooden ribs and national pride. Not the animal, though frankly, a headbutting goat might be less dangerous than what's bolted onto the front of some of these ships. It sticks out like a shark's snout, bolted into a hollow recess below the waterline, crafted for one purpose only: pierce, crack, and, ideally, sink. What's fascinating is how deliberate these rams were. Not slapped on as an afterthought, engineered, sculpted. The designs varied slightly, and that's where things get juicy. Some were curved, others flat-bladed. A few recovered examples even include decorative embellishment swirls, flared tips, stylized animal motifs. One particularly dramatic one resembled a lion's open mouth. Because nothing says we were here to kill you like the jaws of the king of beasts nailed to your boat, historians still argue whether these designs were symbolic, functional, or just the ancient version of hot-rodding your warship. Interestingly, there's evidence that some rams were detachable. You pass another row of ships, their prows resting on wooden blocks. It's a labyrinth. At the center, so faint you almost miss, it is a name. Arishamon, because that's the thing, these weren't just tools. And just like you'd sharpen a blade before battle, rams were inspected obsessively. One fringe theory, and, honestly, this one's kind of fun, suggests some rams included magnetic iron cores. There's also the debate about how these rams were used. It's not like a ship could just casually poke another and sail off. Some scholars believe the ram was only part of the plan. You crouch beside a broken ram half buried in a sandpit near a tool shed, and notice something even weirder. Not a name, not a symbol, but you can't help but smile. And now, as twilight slips in, the ram's shadow grows long across the dock. And just like that, the hum of the shipyard returns, hammers in the distance. Low voices. The sea, waiting. The moon is brushing silver across the rooftops now, and the stars blink lazily overhead, like they know exactly how this story ends, but won't spoil it for you. Somewhere down the coast, a gull gives one long, deflated cry, as if mourning a dropped fish or a missed opportunity. You're starting to feel the weight of the salt air in your shoulders, shipyard's rhythm seeping into your bones like warm honey. Still, there's something left to explore tonight, and it's not flashy or deadly like the ram, but the long, repetitive stretch of wood, each rower gripped for hours, sometimes days in the open sea, at that weird warm wood smell that makes you feel like you re-inside a giant cedar closet. You slide a lantern under one of the beams and see it, a thin, looping set of scratches running the length of the inside paddle. It's faint, but it's there. A message. Not meant for ceremony, not meant for captains or gods. It's for the guy sitting next to you, or maybe just for yourself. And guess what? These weren't just tools either. They were weirdly journals, or venting boards. There's one very shaky attempt at a horse, which looks more like a sack of potatoes with legs. Some of these were probably sketches for fun. Others, maybe protective sigils, drawn instinctively. A wreck found off the coast of Sardinia revealed an oar, with what looked like a game scratched into it, some kind of grid or betting chart. A few bored souls might have turned rowing into a competition, or maybe it was a dice-based distraction carved mid-voyage. Not unlike someone scratching tic-tac-toe into a school desk today. Either a poetic warning, or the rower just really loved his paddle. One prevailing theory suggests that cryptic marks or codes indicated the rower's strength, rhythm preference, or seat history, like tagging a favorite dumbbell at the gym. Others argue that the inscriptions may have helped keep time a primitive metronome, especially if there was no drummer on board. We may never know the rules, but the intention is clear. Keep the mind occupied, while the arms do the punishing rhythmic work. Historians still argue whether these carvings had spiritual significance or were just the Punic version of doodling during a really boring staff meeting. Someone who kept the rhythm for dozens of oars moving in tandem. But not every vessel had that luxury. In those cases, rowers made their own tempo. 3 times. Not fancy, not even proper grammar. It's carved low, near the joint where the oar rests in its housing. Just a fish. Plain, simple, facing upward. You've seen it before. In mosaic tiles, on pottery, even tucked into the corners of religious amulets. Some say it represented abundance, others say rebirth, and a few believe it was the secret sign of safe passage. Because in Carthaginian legend, the fish swims the route of the soul between worlds. But in it, you hear the beat. It's the repetitive insistence of motion. Forward, forward, forward. By chant, by breath, or by the steady mantra of a finger tracing letters into pine, or graffiti walls for sailors with too much bicep and too little sunlight. Other times, oars were shared, passed along from one sweaty stranger to the next. In those cases, these carvings became a kind of logbook, or at least a breadcrumb trail of human grumbling. A long wooden complaint department, floating over miles of indifferent sea. These tools were functional art, shaped to reduce splash and strain. Most oars were made from Lebanese cedar or cypress strong, slightly flexible, and able to hold a polish. Every inch mattered, from the way they tapered to the angle of the grip. But all that beautiful math didn't stop the men wielding them from adding a touch of sarcasm now and then. It's smaller, sneakier, and arguably more personal. These messages usually carved where no superior officer would bother looking, were the sailor's last resort for expression. In fact, many were free citizens, trained specifically for naval warfare. Some even volunteered. The rhythm of rowing, while brutal, became almost meditative, a heartbeat made of wood and sweat and discipline. You'd row until your blisters bled, then keep rowing until the skin hardened into something else. Calluses, maybe, or just sheer willpower. Not exactly literature, but real. Human, tired, sunburned voices speaking across time. We're talking about the hidden messages carved into the backs of Carthaginian oars. Another, even scrappier, just says, "Don't eat the blue fish again." Yes, the oars. It's not the sails, not the flags, not the grand front-facing decorations meant to impress enemy fleets or storm gods. You're on the lower deck of a half-dismantled quadrireme now, the air thick with dust. The text says something like, "When we reach land, I'm kissing the first goat I see." You blink, then chuckle. This is our humor. It's not polished, and it's definitely not sacred. Other oars in this same ship carry variations. One reads, "Tell Mallet I drowned rich." And then there are the symbols. Circles with dots in the center, possibly sunglyphs. Triangles with horizontal lines, maybe waves. You gently touch one of the oars. The wood is pale and smooth from centuries of water and wind. One fringe discovery, and it was punishing. Rowers weren't always slaves in Carthage, that's a common myth. In some ships, each rower had a personal, or that was his seat, his space, his messages, his carved symbols. A kind of identity badge. You spot one now that reads, "If this breaks, I break." Interestingly, some scholars think messages on oars served a practical function too. Yes, some ships did have drummers. Or flute players, in rare cases. You run your thumb over one last message near the base of an oar. It says simply, "We go, we go, we go." Maybe the oars were more than just planks. Maybe they were prayers. And maybe, like all things in Carthage, they existed in two worlds, the physical and the symbolic. a grip for the body, a voice for the soul. One last symbol catches your eye before you leave the deck. And here, among the cramped benches and sweat-darkened beams, it feels oddly peaceful. The wind brushes your face as if trying to say, "We go, we go." You follow the scent of warm tar and cedar back, toward the older ships, those half swallowed by weeds and time, resting crooked in their cradles. These are no longer vessels, they're relics. Skeletons of a navy that once ruled waves from to Crete. Some are so worn their planks curve like the ribs of beached whales. But tonight you're not looking at the outside. There, half obscured by salt-warped ribs, are faint impressions along a beam. They look random at first, tiny gouges, uneven lines, but shine the lantern just right, and they form words, at least the bones of them. Because even on a ship where days were spent transporting purple dye and live goats across deadly stretches of sea, somebody still thought about home, or about a fellow crew member, or, possibly, about that one tavern singer in Utica who only knew 2 chords, but sang like a sea goddess. Historians still debate whether these names are lovers, family, or just good drinking buddies. Repeated across different vessels, always tucked away. A triangle flanked by 2 dots. A stylized eye. Markings to bless a certain bench, a cargo rack, or a section of hull. It looked like a tiny mountain with dots rising above it. Some believe it was a map. Others say it was a coded message. This one's elaborate. 5 straight lines, evenly spaced, intersected by a diagonal slash. It's almost musical. And maybe it was. Some believe sailors scratched out rhythm cues here, especially if the ship lacked a dedicated drummer. Others think it could be a rower rotation system, tally marks, counting how many shifts someone had done. The more marks, the more bragging rights. Carthaginian ships weren't temples, but they weren't diaries either. Defacing the interior could earn punishment, especially on state-owned warships. Captains expected order, cleanliness, uniformity. You didn't scribble your feelings on military property. And one bold theory suggests it marked a burial at CA Place where a crewman's ashes had been scattered or remembered in silence. No big ceremony, just a carving. It's quiet and sacred. And quickly scratching in a sentence, Storm was worse than she looked, or dreamed of land. Smelled oranges, in the company of the guy next to you who hasn't bathed in. That makes them more honest than any official inscription, more revealing than any polished statue or commissioned relief. Several moons, so you carve, you doodle, you leave breadcrumbs of your humanity behind. You wonder how many of these voices remain buried, waiting to be found. How many faces smiled beneath benches. How many hands traced symbols that no one ever bothered to decode. Sharp cheekbones, exaggerated eyes, and what looks like a tongue sticking out. It's been dubbed the laughing mask, and no one agrees on what it meant. A joke? A warning? One expert claimed it was a demon, warding off rats. You can feel it. The pulse of memories hidden just beneath the surface. The quiet rebellion of every carved joke and quiet fear. Another insisted it was the face of a rival captain, drawn mockingly after a trade dispute. Personally, you kind of hope it's just ancient caricature art, something a crew member scratched during a 5-day delay, while their figs went soft in the sun. Some shipwrights may have carved their initials into beams as a signature, an ancient inspected by #27. Others think these were markers of specific duty zones. This barrel S the cook S, the corner belongs to the navigator. Don't touch the rope by the eye symbol unless you want to slap. Spirals, fish bones, even what looks like a miniature tree. Historians still argue whether these were personal sigils, secret prayers, or just the graffiti of bored crewmen trying not to lose their minds at sea. But honestly, who cares? It's tender. It's real. You're squinting beneath the shadows, deep into the inner hole where crew members lived. Stored their gear, and occasionally scratched something that never made it into the captain's log. Because now we're diving into cabin scribbles and secret marks, the inner carvings sailors left behind. Hidden beneath benches, behind supply racks, and sometimes etched into the inside walls of water barrels. That's right. Ancient Carthaginians were apparently not above turning a drinking vessel into a diary. You crawl below the deck of one preserved merchant galley, the wood creaking dramatically with every shift. Zalab loves Sonnet, followed by a very poorly drawn heart. You smile. Move farther back in the same hull and you'll find weirder things, like a simple outline of a hand life-sized fingers spread wide. Maybe a sailor tracing his own hand for a child. Maybe a curse. Maybe a way to say, I was here, in a space that was never meant to be remembered. On another ship, a faded Punic phrase runs under a row of food storage bins. It translates roughly as, "This spot smells like fish." A timeless observation. Then there are the symbols. One academic theory claims these symbols acted as good luck charms. One recovered vessel even had a small mark, barely the size of your thumb tucked, inside a bulkhead near the rowing benches. You pause beside a cracked beam and run your fingers over another pattern. And then there's the fringe stuff. On a merchant shipwreck found near Malta, divers discovered a strange set of carvings beneath the cargo hold. Not just letters or symbols, but a face. Of course, all of this, the hearts, the jokes, the mystery glyphs, was technically against the rules. But sailors did it anyway, because when you're stuck in a hole for 12 days rowing in shifts, your world shrinks to the width of a plank. And here's the magical thing. Many of these carvings weren't meant to be seen again. They were private, intimate, uncurated. You're not reading history here. You're feeling it. You imagine a rower, young, sunburned, maybe limping from a rope burn ducking beneath a deck, squatting near a rib of the ship, and then fading back into duty, back into silence. Letting the ship carry the words forward. The ship you're standing in now is still, but that doesn't matter. And as you climb out of the hull, stretching your back and brushing off sawdust, you may never know what they meant. But they meant something. You wake a little more noun because the night's getting colder, but because something just brushed against your ankle. It's not a ghost, probably, just a loose coil of rope swaying in the breeze. And as you meander along the edge of the docks, your eyes catch something odd hanging from a rotting spar, a length of driftwood dangling from a rope like a charm. On closer inspection, it's etched shallow carvings, circular patterns. Someone once believed this piece of wood could protect a ship. Still, you lift your foot like it insulted your sandals and shuffle past it with more dignity than is strictly necessary. Now, the shipyard is behind you. The stars are fully out. Because tonight, we're uncovering the ritual carvings, superstitions, and sacred geometry that Carthaginians etched into their ships not for style, but for survival. You look again at that driftwood talisman. It might have come from a tiller, or maybe it was part of a broken mast. That certain Carthaginian captains employed geomancers, spiritual advisors who recommended particular symbols, placements, or even specific woods. To channel divine favor, probably, sounds dramatic until you realize that even Roman sources whispered about the obsidian, knuckled priests of Carthage who traveled with fleets, performing quiet rituals with knives and chalk before launching into war. And a third might hide 3 lines under the tiller crossbeam a reference. Perhaps to Ball Hammond's triad or just a tally of surviving storms. Historians still argue whether these geometric carvings served navigational purposes, primitive charts, reminders of port distances, whether they were mnemonic devices for remembering stories, maps, or prophecies. But the regularity of the shapes suggests planning, not boredom. Someone meant them to last. Some believe that by carving them into the steering apparatus, you'd ensure your vessel would stay true, no matter how lost your soul became in the mist.
One long rudder plank.
Someone has carved a pair of birds, wings stretched wide. Merchant ship near Lixus, with a carved image of a fish swallowing a moon. Historians have no consensus on what it means. Some suggest lunar tides, others say it references eclipses. Carvings weren't for show, they were for fingers. For the act of touching, remembering, and believing. Or maybe they were all 3. Tangled together in the subconscious of a culture that trusted wood and salt more than law and parchment. In a world of uncertain tides and invisible monsters, belief was a sailor's real compass. One rogue academic insists it's an inside joke about overcooked seafood stew. The truth? Probably all of the above. It's barely visible under the oil and dust, but the lines are clean, confident. This symbol has shown up as far afield as Sicily and even parts of Sardinia, into planks, coin molds, and boundary stones. It may have symbolized cyclical fate or divine balance. Or just the sailor's hope that every journey, no matter how wild, would someday bring you full circle, back home. It's probably carved before the rudder was installed, probably carved with purpose. A typical Carthaginian warship might carry 5 or more such glyphs, each tucked discreetly where only the crew would know to look. There, in the dark curve of its bow, is a set of mathematical-looking carvings, a row of interlocking triangles descending in size. Not random, not decorative. This is sacred geometry. Like the Egyptians, the Carthaginians believed certain shapes held cosmic resonance. The triangle in particular was a symbol of stability and protection, 3 points representing land, sea, and sky, or body, soul, and fate. Or maybe just the triangle sandwich, because after all, these sailors were very hungry men. It doesn't matter. What matters is what it carries. A spiral, surrounded by 7 dots. It's right near its base, beneath a faint line of pitch, is a perfect geometric square with an X through it. Greek ones? Statues of Poseidon or Athena lashed to the mast. But the Carthaginians were more distributed in their approach. Gods were everywhere, wind, rope end. The carvings reflected this. Small layered acts of faith scattered throughout the vessel like breadcrumbs to the divine. This isn't your classic symbol of don't touch. It's more likely a ritualistic blessing, a sigil meant to hold the ship's direction true, because sailors didn't trust just stars and sails. They trusted patterns. This symbol appears over and over in shipwrecks and dockyard debris from across the Punic world. Historians still argue whether it was a solar sign, a sea goddess reference, or some forgotten bit of proto-cartography. But across dozens of vessels, it shows up carved on steering rudders, cargo hatches, and even beneath the ceremonial figureheads. Carvings like these weren't just decorative. They were protection, whispered onto the wood in the only language sailors really trusted. Symbols you could touch. One sailor might draw a protective eye on the hull, another a wave to fool the sea. You reach a reconstructed sternpost, propped up like a museum piece in the moonlight. One fringe belief among modern researchers. Don't worry, no animals were harmed in these minor rituals. You pass a partially restored vessel, now its hull cracked open like a walnut hand. Peer inside, the debate rages on. Carthage, unlike its rivals, didn't centralize religion on ships. Roman ships might carry a miniature altar to Neptune. You step into one of the reconstructed ship workshops, a warehouse of masts, keels, and bracing beams. Birds often represented messengers in Punic mythology, beings who could pass between realms. One particularly fascinating find. You spot another symbol high on a mast, a simple circle with 6 spokes. It looks like a wheel, but this was no axle. You lean against the mast, running your fingers across the dry, scratched surface, and realize how tactile this all is. Maybe these symbols were prayers, or spells, or math. You close your eyes, in the stillness, you can almost hear it. A quiet chorus of whispers, each symbol humming its own little protection spell, like lullabies burned into cedar. Because long after the storms pass, and the sails come down, and the oars fall still, these carvings remain. They're not just marks, they're promises. The wind softens now, settling into a hush. You stand between 2 rows of ship ribs, half buried in the sand, like the bones of extinct sea beast sand. You start to notice something different. Not the usual sacred spirals or sailor scribbles, but animal shapes. Carefully carved, distinct, and far too intentional to be decorative whimsy. Their legendary cavalry didn't ride into battle just for tactics, they rode as symbols of divine favor. Even their top god, Baal-Haman, had associations with the sun and fire, often connected to horses through chariot imagery. It's a dolphin jumping over stylized waves, graceful, on the sternpost. Barely visible beneath a smear of tar is something toothy. In Egyptian myth, jackals guarded the underworld. In Punic superstition, they could represent cleverness, or the ability to sneak past the gaze of angry gods. On a preserved cargo ship near Eleusis, researchers found a carved ape hanging upside down from what looks like a tree branch. The arms are absurdly long, and its mouth is open as if mid-shriek. There's no clear reason for this to exist. There, in the shadows where rowers once hunched, is a tiny lizard tail curling into a spiral. These were likely part of a larger symbolic grammar. A lion's paw, for example, might signify strength without the arrogance of the full lion. This wasn't graffiti. This was intentional. A serpent biting its own tail is one of the oldest symbols of eternity. In Carthaginian context, it might have represented continuity, as ships surviving one cycle to begin another. Or maybe it meant this mast's cursed if you touch it. A bird's wing might suggest swiftness without the need for an actual eagle. Minimalist emoji, 300 BC style. They were part of a language of belief that traveled with each ship, whispered through the wood, tucked into shadows where seawater and time could only fade them, not erase them. Lizards were symbols of regeneration. They shed and survive. In the half-light, another animal takes shape, a hawk in flight, wings stretched wide and talons extended. It's carved in just 3 lines. Its form is more suggestion than detail, but it still feels alive. Hawks like eagles represented vision, control, the ability to strike with deadly precision. Some captains may have carved hawks into their command posts as a way to channel that energy reminders, to stay sharp, to lead with foresight. In Carthage, they were occasionally associated with rebirth and healing, perhaps why this one was carved near the rowing section, where backs ached and blisters burst. Not exactly what you expect on the high seas. But camels represented endurance, adaptation, and the ability to survive in extreme environments. Maybe the ship had crossed from deeper inland, or maybe the camel was a crewman's quiet joke a wink at how long they'd been away from home. Monkeys weren't native to the region, though they were traded from sub-Saharan Africa. Because here's what these animal carvings really tell you. They weren't random. They were chosen. Specific creatures in specific places made by hands that understood the power of symbol. Some were personal, others collective. Some were fear-based, others aspirational. Was it a crewman's doodle, a reference to a personal joke, or something ritualistic? Finding one etched beneath the helm might have been a way to ensure smooth escapes. Or, more cheekily, to tell rivals, we're smarter than you. A jagged triangle with dots for eyes, a sea monster maybe, or maybe a shark. These rarely show up in land carvings, but a handful of recovered ship planks do feature exaggerated fish or serpent-like creatures, often coiled or leaping. Were they literal fears, or metaphors for power? Historians still debate whether these symbols warned of actual dangers, hostile waters. Hidden reef sores simply represented a kind of mystical boasting, smiling in that charming dolphin way that says, I know all your secrets. Some believe dolphins were guide symbols of safe travel and good omens for journeys through unfamiliar waters. In Carthage, they also whispered of naval cunning. Dolphin etched near the prow might have been meant to fool enemies. Projecting speed, a kind of sympathetic magic trap, the madness in the wood. Keep it from infecting the crew during long, suffocating voyages. Sounds ridiculous. Until you've been stuck in a wooden box with 30 unwashed men and a shipment of fermented onions for 3 weeks. And lightness, where there was, in fact, a heavy, deceptive bulk. So when you find a carving of a horse's head near the bow of a war galley, ears pinned and mane flared, it isn't just for show, it's a signal, a warning, a prayer for speed and precision in battle. A horse, a dolphin. One theory suggests specific animals were assigned to different dockyards. Lions for North Africa, eagles for Sicily, and bulls for coastal Iberia. No one's confirmed it yet, but if true, it would make ancient warships less like faceless tools and more like personalized avatars of a city's pride. A crouching lion with claws etched so delicately you could mistake them for feathers. Tonight, you're sliding into the world of animal iconography. The carved creatures that curled their way into Carthaginian boat design, not just for beauty, but for symbolism, superstition, and maybe even stealthy political statements. The most common animal? Horses. No surprise there. Carthage was famously horse-obsessed. Historians still argue whether these horse carvings were individual, emblems like mascots, or whether they represented regional fleets, like squad logos painted on military planes. Then you notice another carving lower on the hull, near the waterline. You walk along the spine of another ship, your fingertips brushing the dry timbers. One particular carving sends a chill down your neck. It's a crouched jackal knot, native to Carthage, but very much a symbolic import from older North African traditions. Now comes the weird stuff. One fringe theory posits that sailors carved apes and monkeys to ward off madness. You climb aboard one of the reconstructions and kneel by the starboard benches. Some animals weren't carved whole, but as fragments a single wing, a paw, a set of claws. A particularly stunning find was a serpent in a figure 8 carved delicately into a mast's support beam, then filled with red pigment. You chuckle, imagining a sailor scolding a crewmate. Oi, not the red snake mast. You want us all dead? You lean back and look at the ceiling of the low deck. One particularly strange carving found aboard a sunken Carthaginian blockade ship was a camel. You smile again, but all of them, every tail, claw, wing, and snout, meant something to someone. You let your fingers trail along the last creature, a curled fox, watching with blank eyes, and you whisper, "Stay sharp." You're ankle-deep in sand again, warm grains pressing against your soles as you follow the fading outline of a hull. This ship is smaller than the others, lighter, built for speed or perhaps something less nobles. Muggling, maybe. It's a series of overlapping triangles, flanked by dots and a strange curling line like a fishhook trying to write cursive. And there, beneath the warp of time and tide, you spot something faint. A symbol carved with crisp edges that refuse to soften, even after centuries of salt and storm. Not quite writing, not quite decoration. These symbols feel like whispers from a private language when only sailors spoke and only ships carried. It's not an animal, not a deity, not even a face. It's a symbol. They appear along the keel inside the rowing benches, and especially near the rudder mount. Others could be marking cargo holds or deck divisions, but more than a few seem purely symbolic. One ship had a triangle surrounded by 7.7. The number 7 had sacred significance in many Mediterranean cultures, often representing wholeness or divine cycles. Carved into the internal support beams, not visible to outsiders, some think it was a war token, symbolizing blood spilled or battles survived. Some carvings on ships mimic alphabets but don't form real words, not in Punic, Phoenician, or any neighboring script. Whatever its original meaning, you're now convinced it had to do with navigation. A coded map, a symbolic compass, sailor's mandala. It probably meant something like, keep heading true and don't fall off the edge of the world. Which, frankly, isn't the worst advice even now. These faux scripts may have been magical, mimicking the form of prayer or protection, like intentional symmetry. That's not decorative, it's ritualistic. Some scholars believe this kind of symmetry was used to balance spiritual energy on the ship, keeping bad luck from tilting the voyage. Imagine explaining that to your shipbuilder. Yes, the hull's fine, but the karma's listing starboard. Think of it like writing a protective charm in a made-up language, if the gods get the vibe. The words don't have to make sense. One fringe theory says these fake scripts were meant to confuse evil spirits, who'd get so busy trying to read them that they'd leave the ship alone. Others say it's an early form of intimidation, a crew's way of saying, "We've drawn steel before, and we'll do it again." Historians still argue whether these dagger symbols were for spiritual warding or practical warnings or both. Carved discreetly near the captain's platform, almost hidden beneath a lip of plank, is a small maze. But as a living entity, something that listened, watched, judged. Carthaginian sailors didn't just launch their ships, they warded them, blessed them, arced them with all the superstitions and jokes and sorrows that made them human. Simple, just a few spirals and lines, but unmistakably a labyrinth. You stare at it, wondering, was it a challenge, a joke, a metaphor for command? Maybe it meant that leadership wasn't about clear directions. It was about surviving the confusion, given how hard sailors were to scare. Maybe it was just a morale boost. If the dagger's still upright, we're still winning. It's still unclear if the dots were meant as a spiritual message or just an early form of a shipping manifest. Don T. Forget, box number 7. It's got the olives. It's not a cheerful thing to find on a cargo ship. Some believe it represents sacrifice, either literal, as in a life lost at sea, or metaphorical, a warning to respect the ocean's moods. The fact that it is paired with a sunburst in another section of the ship only deepens the mystery. Crying sun? Is tragic optimism? Or just some poor sailor carving what he missed most? Some speculate they were dockyard marks, helping craftsmen assemble standardized parts. It appears far more often than any wave motif should. This wasn't an artist showing off. This was a sign. Theories range from tide calendars to sea route talismans. One suggestion is that it marked ships which had crossed the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Sort of a nautical badge of honor. This boat went west and lived to tell about it. Others think they were ownership sigils, like tagging your name on your gear before someone else borrows it forever. Welcome to the mystery of maritime symbols, the strange. coded glyphs and abstract marks carved into Carthaginian boats that still stump modern historians. Many of these marks are geometric interlocking shapes, often circles, diamonds, or zigzags. But here's where things get spicy. Some of these symbols show up on temple reliefs and urns too. Historians still argue whether that means these marks were sacred, or if they were used by elite maritime families who blurred the lines between faith and trade. One particularly debated example is a trident-like symbol carved into both a war galley's tiller and the lintel of a Punic shrine in Utica. Coincidence? A family crest? A god's favor? The jury's out. You run your hand along another plank and there it is. A spiral with a line through it. You've seen that one before in 3 different shipwrecks, each from a different century. It's a popular one. Some believe it symbolizes safe return, like a road looping back to its start. Others argue it was a sort of sailor's pun. We go in circles, but we always make it home. You can almost hear the grizzled helmsman telling that joke for the 20th time. Now, let's talk about numerical marks. These weren't abstract. They were tally-like lines, slashed in deliberate clusters. Some appear to count rows or rations. You reach the stern post again and squint to make out a repeated motif. A double wave. Carved like the letter W, but stretched and flowing. But not all the marks were peaceful. On at least 4 recovered warships, there's a sigil resembling an upturned dagger. One especially strange mark appears on a merchant vessel buried under layers of amphory. It looks like a stylized eye with tears. Then there's the fake writing. Yes, fake. You pause at the rudder. Someone had carved a circle inside a triangle, inside another circle. It's almost hypnotic. Your one recently studied shipwreck revealed something truly strange. Paired symbols that mirrored each other perfectly across the port and starboard sides. And here's your last symbol for the night. These aren't just doodles. These are fingerprints of a mindset. A way of seeing the sea not just as distance. So next time someone tells you ancient sailors were just rough hands with calloused feet, ask them what kind of man carves a crying sun or a fake language into his hull. And when the ship groans in the water and the horizon tilts, ... maybe you'll understand. The planks creak again under your steps, but this ship feels different, less ornamented. Fewer carvings, no swirls or sigils to whisper about dolphins or curses. Instead, you spot something plainer, but just as deliberate. No flourish, no extra symbols, just a match. These are alignment marks, like ancient IKEA instructions. Slot tab A into groove B. This one appears over and over again in Carthaginian shipwrecks. Not structural, not decorative. It might have been a builder's signature not to show off, but to record who made which part. But here's the kicker. On some ships, these marks go out of order. Why? A fringe theory says these were codes for magical protection intentional disorder to confuse bad spirits. It's kind of like leaving a deliberate mistake in a perfect pattern to avoid hubris. Or maybe the guy marking the beams just lost count. Like a blacksmith whispering, even the invisible deserves beauty. On a few surviving planks, there's a technique called kerfing short angled cuts to guide wood bending. But in Carthaginian ships, some of these kerfs are too shallow to serve a structural function. So, why are they there? The answer might be symbolic kerfing, near the aft bulkhead. It's almost invisible until the moonlight catches it just right. A fringe idea? Sure, but compelling. Marks made to mimic construction techniques without actual need. Sort of a builder's wink to tradition or ritual. It's like wearing suspenders with a belt. You don't need both. But hey, respect the craft. Who's to say? Think of it as the ancient world's version of initials on a lunchbox. You'll find groove patterns following the length of the keel. Ships tell stories, yes, but they also collect them. Some beams show layering old tally marks cut over with new ones. Burned initials paired with later repair grooves. It's like the boat itself is a palimpsest, a diary written and rewritten by a dozen hands over decades. At first glance, they look functional maybe for water flow or structural flex. But dig deeper and you'll find inconsistencies. Because maybe, just maybe, that builder wanted to send his mark across more than just wood. He wanted to connect ships across time, across miles. Secret handshake in timber. Some grooved lines don't serve any physical purpose. They curve. They stop short. They start again. Some believe they were symbolic channels, letting spirit forces flow through the ship unhindered. Okay, that's dramatic. But the ancient world was deeply spiritual. If you believed your vessel was alive, wouldn't you want its soul to breathe properly? Historians believe these were early measuring jigs, markers for bending planks to an exact curve. And now you're realizing something. This wasn't just carpentry. This was choreography. Everything had rhythm. Every plank, angle, riveted, all worked together like a drum line of wood and bronze. A few ships show clusters of these, suggesting teams, shifts, or apprentice master pairings. Oh, you got the V-shaper? Yeah, his ribs never split. Some believe it represents load zones, an ancient way to show stress points or weight tolerances. Others think it marked timber origin, this piece from the northern grove or felled in spring, seasoned for combat. There's even a theory that these marks were embedded with ritual value, that certain woods, marked a certain way, were believed to make a vessel luckier. It's not from fire damage. Too deliberate, too clean. Carthaginian ships used a combo of iron spikes, wooden pegs, and even twisted cordage to hold their hulls together. But some of those iron nails have decorative heads, little circles, flowers, even concentric rings. No sailor would see them, they're buried in the belly of the beast. So why the flare? Few archaeologists think they were status indicators, marking ships of higher class or elite funding. Imagine your boss walking into the shipyard and saying, "Don't give me that plain nail nonsense. I want the deluxe rivets." Some researchers believe it was made using heated metal tools as part of a ritual sealing process. A blessing of sorts once the vessel was complete. Picture the builder stepping back after months of labor, holding a red-hot brand, inking it into the finished timber with a muttered prayer to ball or tan it. Maybe with some wine spilled into the hold for luck, because he spilled wine a lot. Carthaginian shipbuilders used these systems to assemble complex hulls fast and accurately, especially when churning out warships under pressure. Historians still argue whether these systems were standardized across the entire empire, or if each dockyard had its own carpenter's shorthand. A carefully scored sequence of horizontal notches chiseled with cold precision into the inner hull. Yovi just stumbled into the world of construction codes and craftsmanship, marks the backstage script of the Carthaginian shipbuilders, invisible to sailors, but essential to the ones who built the bones of the beast. Let's start simple. See a plank with 3 diagonal lines near its top edge, matching 3 similar lines on the beam above it. What's fascinating is how mathematical the whole thing feels. The Punic tradition of shipbuilding borrowed from Phoenician methods, where proportional harmony mattered deeply. Some beams show golden ratio-like measurements. The spacing between ribs often follows deliberate increments that hint at geometric planning. It wasn't just build it strong, it was build it beautifully and symmetrically, even if no one ever sees it. You kneel beside a half-rotted beam and trace a cluster of marks that look like a sideways ladder. Then you find something strange. A small, repeating V-shaped gouge, always located near the base of ribs. One particularly fine galley shows sequential numerical mark scratchings that, when counted, seem to follow a logic like tallying. 4 lines, then a diagonal across. As you duck beneath a midsection crossbeam, you spot another marvel: tiny copper pins. Embedded inside the wood, each one aligned with a chalky residue in a faded shape. And then you come to the strange scorch mark. A soft black ring, faintly circular, singed into the deck of one cargo vessel. There's also the matter of nails. Not exciting? Think again. You rub your fingers over another one of those decorative heads, the pattern still crisp under your skin. Some carvings are even more elusive. Now shift your eyes to the outer hull. And here's the kicker. Not all these marks were carved during construction. Some were added years later, after voyages, after battles, after loss. And just when you think you've seen every scratch, notch, and groove, your eyes catch a final faint curve. A spiral again, like the one back on that war galley. And you smile. And now, you know how to see it. You pause beneath the partial skeleton of another Carthaginian hull, the beams around you sighing softly like they're exhaling secrets. The deeper you go into these ships, the more they start to feel familiar, not in the way of modern boats with clean fiberglass lines and squeaky hinges, but human. Lived in, touched not just by hands but by rituals. You're a Carthaginian shipwright, your new vessel gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, your crew pacing the dock, all eyes on you. But you don't just shove off and hope for smooth sailing. No. First comes the blessing ceremony, a tradition as fixed in time as the grain of olive wood. Don't worry, we'll keep this PG. A short inscription scrawled in uneven lines, almost hidden behind the rudder mount. Translated, it reads, "Forgive me." Some scholars think these post-construction markings were last-minute prayers, scratched in by nervous crewmen or anxious captains. Think of them like carving please work onto the side of a rocket before launch, not protocol but deeply human. Usually, it was a small bird or goat, offered up with prayers for calm seas. Well, not anymore, it's just the remains of the cord. But once it held something, dried herbs, a charm, a lock of hair. Some believe it was part of a protective fetish, tied into the ship like a tucked-away seatbelt. Not necessary, ... until it was. And once in a while, the blood was daubed onto the prow or rudder, the literal heartbeat of the boat. No hammering, no jokes, no shouting about whose tools got stolen again. Just silence. Breath held, way of letting the spirit of the ship hear its name.
Weird, sure.
But even today, you probably wouldn't want someone yelling bad luck stuff when you're boarding a plane. Same vibe. There's a fringe theory that blood was even mixed into pitch for sealing the hull. It's an early example of bind the ship with life. One recovered ship even had a carved footstep outline at the gangplank, meant to ensure the correct foot led the journey. It's believed that crew members left marks before the maiden voyage, sort of like signing a contract with the sea. Sneezing during a launch, cancel the voyage. A rat jumping ship, postpone everything. A lizard crawling across the bow, not real, just memory. Maybe it's the wind through the frame. Living things, spirits with sails. And every scratch, every symbol, every coin and whispered word wasn't superstition. Or maybe it's the echo of all those whispered blessings, all those fears and promises soaked into the wood. The ship isn't whole anymore, but its rituals, they linger. One sailor's good luck, another's vacation-ending panic. Historians still argue whether these omens were rooted in formal religion or just layers of seaborne folklore stacked like barnacles on the hull of time. Handprints, thumb marks, even kisses pressed into wet pitch. Some were elaborate, surrounded by sigils or initials. Others were just plain. But each one said, "I was here. I trusted this wood." Kind of dramatic. It's very on brand for ancient sailors. And as your fingers slide along the edge of a bulkhead, you see it again faint, suit darkened, nestled low where only someone squatting to scrub the deck would notice it. A tiny carved handprint, surrounded by a ring of dots. You've just entered the world of ritual boat blessings and sacred superstition, a realm where craftsmanship was on T complete until the gods signed off, or even the finest galley was on T, considered seaworthy until it had been made spiritually airtight. Carthaginians didn't just slap names on hulls like bumper stickers. Naming a ship was an event. Offerings were made, incense burned, and the name carved and painted into the bow. Names often invoked deities, constellations, or forces of nature. Wind's child, watcher of the east, the voice of Baal, and once named a ship took on a kind of personality. Some were feared, some were revered. Some had reputations more dangerous than their captains. Not flashy, just a bronze or silver piece pressed deep into the joinery, out of sight. One account tells of sailors tucking tiny clay amulets into hidden crevices on board shaped like fish, breasts, or even grinning masks. Why? To ward off jealousy, storms, or boredom, depending on the mood. One recovered boat had over 20 of these, stuffed behind paneling and beneath benches. It was either incredibly cursed or had a crew with separation anxiety. Some believe it was an offering to Tanit, the protector of sailors. Others think it was practically if the ship went down, the spirit had toll fare for the afterlife. Or, maybe the foreman just liked hiding loose change. So, let's set the scene. Most blessings involved libations win, or oil poured at the bow or keel, a gift to the gods of sea and storm. It was in tea uncommon for shipbuilders to anoint the hull with resin mixed with herbs or crushed juniper berries. It's not just for waterproofing, but to scent the ship with holiness. Historians still argue whether these blessings followed strict religious guidelines or were more personal, a bit of structured superstition passed down from grizzled shipwright to wide-eyed apprentice. One documented practice was the sacrificial coin, slid under the mast-foot before final assembly, but some blessings were far more theatrical. On certain ceremonial ships, especially those meant for long expeditions or diplomatic, Missions and animal sacrifice played a role. You lean down and brush sand off the floorboards. Another mark, this one less artistic, more frantic. Then there's the naming ritual. Of course, not all superstitions were solemn, or downright bizarre. And remember that handprint you saw earlier? It wasn't random. You look up and spot an odd little bundle hanging from a beam. And then there's ritual silence. Some shipyards held moments of total quiet during the final key laying or the raising of the mast. Not all blessings were public. Some captains had their own rituals, stepping onto deck with the left foot first, uttering a certain phrase before issuing the first command. And you'd better believe they had bad omens too. You run your hand along one final timber, and you swear there's something like a hum. It reminds you that, for the Carthaginians, ships weren't tools, they were partners. It was survival. You shuffle a little deeper into the shipyard's ghostly shadow, the hulls above creaking ever so gently in the breeze. You almost expect to hear whispers between the timbers, but what you hear instead is laughter faint, imagined, carried over centuries from men who weren't praying or working. They were decorating, an ego, and occasionally some very weird animal carvings. Yep, that's definitely a carved duck. Not stylized, not symbolic, just a duck. One leg up, wings spread, beak open like it's yelling at someone. Why? Well, nobody knows. But it's nestled into the base of a support beam, out of sight unless you were crawling around underneath the benches. Some are well rendered, detailed noses, earrings, even elaborate beards. Some might have been mascots. One small merchant galley even had a carved mouse with a curved tail wrapping into a natta possible inside. Joke about rats always abandoning ship. It's thought sailors passed time with a game resembling ancient backgammon or mancala, scraping small grooves into the deck and using pebbles, seeds, or fish bones to play. It makes you wonder how many tense days at sea were broken by the phrase, "You cheated." That move's not allowed, or maybe the guy just liked mice. Either way, these weren't public-facing decorations. These were hidden deep in the ship's frame, beneath benches, behind storage compartments, or along internal supports. One boat shows a figure with a triangle above its head, possibly a stylized representation of a woman. Maybe someone left behind. Another carving features a pair of clasped hands, eerily human in their shape and precision. Was it rivalry? Spite? Or maybe a sailor trying to erase someone else's memory? Historians still argue whether these edits were part of shifting crew dynamics, or just one guy fed up with seeing another man scout doodle every morning. It's deeply intimate, like someone etched a promise into the wood itself. Private art never meant for the admiral's eyes. And they left those things behind, not in gold or scrolls, but in casual knife marks hidden where only the ship could see. A handful of recovered rudder stocks include mysterious motifs, some resembling eyes, others spirals, others, in one case, what looks suspiciously like a smiling fish. These doodles were never meant to impress. They were meant to belong. Say I was here. This was mine. And this ship, it knew me. These might have been for good luck, or maybe to make the helmsman feel less alone. One fringe theory posits that these were seen as guardian eyes, watching the waves behind. Ship's version of a rear-view mirror deity. It's rough and small, carved where only the crew sleeping beneath that beam would ever notice. Some weren't so serious. Few appear to be initials or abbreviations crew members quietly signing their work, leaving a little legacy behind. One ship had over 24 of these in the lower deck alone. A wooden hall of fame, etched out in stubby letters and crooked lines. Another ship had a short inscription scratched into the inner rail. "The sea is big. My appetite is bigger." It's very relatable. 5 of them, all left feet, different sizes. Were they ceremonial? A drinking game? A crude dance map? No one knows. But it's charming to think of sailors tracing their own feet in boredom, a little wooden footprint family sharing the dark belly of a cargo ship. Others, let us just say they were probably done by someone who should never have been handed a chisel. Historians still argue whether these were tributes to real people or caricatures of shipmates. The sternposts, for example, those long vertical extensions at the back of the ship, were prime real estate for flair. One famous Carthaginian warship's stern was carved to resemble a lion's head. Mouth open, teeth detailed down to the last groove. Another bore a sea serpent motif, its tail coiling down toward the rudder. It wasn't just intimidation, it was swagger. It said this ship has bite. One ship has 3 heads lined up, each more absurd than the last, with one sporting an exaggerated nose and another with bug eyes. The fringe theory? Some of the best art came from drunk sailors on night watch, armed with a knife, a bored brain, and just enough creative energy to carve a chicken dancing with a jug of wine. Sound ridiculous? One recovered beam from a merchant galley features what appears to be a donkey, wearing a helmet. Likely the ancient world's version of drawing your boss as a potato, carefully scorched in with heated iron tools, possibly poker tips. Some believe this was a form of tagging or branding, where sailors claimed ownership over personal storage space. Kind of like carving your name into your locker. Others believe these marks had deeper symbolic meanings, possibly related to home ports or personal identity marks passed down from sailor to sailor, which means someone took the time to add it for the sole purpose of ... existing. It turns out, for all the war and trade and tragedies surrounding ancient Carthaginian ships, some parts were just about fun. You crouch beneath the skeleton of what was once a light war galley and squint. Bored people make art. Sometimes crude, sometimes cheeky, and sometimes surprisingly beautiful. And what they carved into the inner parts of their ships gives you a glimpse into their private world of duty. Unfiltered, and often hilarious. You're entering the world of personal graffiti and shipboard doodles, and it's a whole archaeological rabbit hole or duck pond, in this case. Carthaginian sailors, like anyone stuck in a wooden box for months on end, got bored. Let's start with the profile carvings. Dozens of ships, especially military ones, have turned up with little human faces etched into random corners. Then there are the animals: horses, cats, fish, birds, and at least one very confident-looking goat, mid-strut. And let's not forget the symbolic doodles: spirals, stars, wave patterns, all the way down to what looks suspiciously like a game board carved into a cabin floor. And the boats themselves weren't immune to these flourishes. Now, those decorative touches weren't always planned by shipwrights. Some were added mid-voyage, possibly even after long stints at sea. You pass another wooden plank, only this one doesn't have a carving. It has burned marks. And the more you look, the more personal it becomes. There's even evidence of jokes carved into ships. One galley features an etching of a man with his pants falling down, chasing what might be a flying fish. Of course, not everyone approved. Some carvings were defaced, faces scratched out, names crossed through. And here's something strange. One merchant vessel has a series of footprints carved into its inner wall. Even the rudders weren't spared. And remember those secret marks we saw earlier in construction codes? It's easy to forget that ancient sailors were also just people with crushes, inside jokes, favorite animals, and very questionable drawing skills. So as you rest your hand on one of those worn, scribbled beams, carved with ducks and donkeys and dreams, you realize something. You step back, letting your eyes adjust to the shadows of the last chamber. It's quieter here, quieter than quiet, like the air itself is holding its breath. The hull above is thick, the light barely spills in. And the beams form a rib cage around you, like the ship has finally drawn you into its heart. And here, buried beneath the carved names, the sacred blessings, and the dancing goats, is something different. Something colder. Battle scars. Tonight, we wade into the part of the story the carvings didn't laugh about. Some slices are shallow, glancing. Others run deep into the bulkheads. Their warships were engineering masterpieces, sleek and fast. Usually based on the Phoenician trireme model, but adapted for their own style of naval brawling. The famed quinquareme, for example, had 5 tiers of rowers and could tear through enemy hulls like a battering ram with a vendetta. You don't need to be a specialist to imagine the cause. Most likely a bolt about the length of your arm and twice as sharp. They trained for boarding actions, for defense, for rowing while arrows thudded into the deck like hail. Some ships even show evidence of repeated repairs mid-campaign, fresh plugs of wood in otherwise aged hulls, splinting to reinforce cracked strakes, and different resins used like bandages. They didn't give up on their ships. They patched them, again and again. You'd never hear it coming over the waves. But when it hit, splinters everywhere, shattered ribs, screams. Some experts believe it was from ramming tactics, maybe even experimental maneuvers where the ship would strike in reverse, using the stern instead of the bow. Blood, yes, PG here, but still soaked into some of these boards. On some wrecks, we find neatly drilled holes or structural cuts that make no sense unless they were intentional, possibly to prevent the ship from falling into enemy hands, or to send it into the sea, taking secret sand sailors with it. Floating villages with their own culture, humor, arguments, and memories. So even as they shattered enemy lines or sank beneath the waves, they kept their soul. They carried it in their wounds. Imagine carving little blessings into the beams one week and slicing those same beams apart the next. War is cruel like that. In salt water, it disappears fast. But chemical tests on some timbers show unusual iron deposits clustered near impact sites. You don't need a lab to guess what that means. Even on the most battered hulls, you'll find a sailor's doodle still intact. Palm print, half-burned. Fish, scratched beside a ram strike scar, as if to say, we fought. But we lived here too. Wild. Maybe. But desperate navies try wild things, especially when outnumbered. And Carthage, especially in the later Punic Wars, was often outgunned. Bronze-tipped rams, ballista bolts, maybe even fragments of fire pots. The resilience. The carved memory. The echoes of sailors who believed a ship wasn't finished until it was named blessed and bloodied. If you were very quiet back then, right before battle, you might have heard that too. The creak of wood under tension, the muttered prayers, the silent fear. Still lodged in the woods centuries later, no telling whether it hit during a battle or was flung by a bored soldier during drills, but it stayed. It survived. You imagine it whistling through the air, slamming into the beam, then silence. A grim punctuation mark. Because as beautiful as Carthaginian, ships were laced with symbols and handprints and ancient mischief. They were built for conflict, and many of them didn't make it home. This part of the ship, it's a battlefield in wood. The first thing you notice are the splinter trails, long gouges in the grain, where something fast, hard and angry tore through. One prow figure whence a lion's head is missing half its snarl. Not from erosion, but from a direct blow. The break pattern matches the impact arc of a boarding hook or grappling spike. Someone aimed to kill the image, maybe as a symbolic gesture. Take the head off the lion, and maybe the sailors lose their nerve. Carthage didn't just build merchant vessels and fancy pleasure boats. You can still see the ghosts of the originals underneath, like faded tattoos. Historians still argue whether these overwrites were done out of efficiency, desperation, or simply to humiliate the enemy. Historians love to argue, especially when the original records are vague and a bit poetic. But whatever the configuration, the ships were intimidating, and often armed to the teeth. Some scholars still debate what quinquareme really meant. Was it 5 oars per row, 5 men per oar, or 5 decks? You trace your fingers over a warped timber, blackened and brittle. Fire damage? Greek fire? Maybe. Or more likely, a tar-soaked javelin or flaming slingstone, common tactics in close naval brawls. Some of the scorch marks are haphazard.
Okay.
Others look almost surgical. Someone targeted this part of the ship deliberately. It's probably the rudder. It's cut the rudder, and you turn a galley into driftwood. And just thereby, your ankle-around hole, edges smooth from centuries, but unmistakable. That's ballista damage, a naval equivalent of a sniper shot. War was not elegant. And for all their rituals, their duck carvings and sea god sigils, Carthaginian sailors were also soldiers. One recovered keel showed an odd, repeated stress fracture pattern. You run your hand across a length of framing near the bow there, you feel something unusual. Embedded metal. A tiny, corroded spike. Probably a dart. Even the decorative elements bore scars. Some ships were captured and repurposed, scratched, symbols overwritten, names crudely chiseled away, new emblems carved on top. And what about the bodies? You won't see them here, but the wood remembers. Then there's the deliberate damage. Sabotage. Self-scuttling. You step lightly across a hollow-sounding plank and hear the faint echo deep. Thudding like the ship's heart skipping. And yet, here's the thing. Amid all this destruction, the carvings remain. These weren't just war machines. They were homes. And now, centuries later, as you stand in the echo of their silence, you can still feel it. You linger now at the very edge of the collection, where the oldest timbers slouch like tired veterans, and time itself seems to lean on the walls. You've seen every strange carving, every bit of whimsy and wounding. But here, in this soft dimness, a final detail waits one that outlasted every stroke, storm, and siege. The boats weren't just born, were buried. Because long before these vessels ended up on museum floors or seabeds, Carthaginians treated some of them with care bordering on reverence, especially the ones that served long and hard. And tonight, we whisper through the quiet world of ship retirement rituals. See, Carthage didn't just scrap old vessels. Some were ritually sunk, often with a formal farewell carved or painted into the hull. A few of these phrases have survived, scraped by time, but still legible. "She carried the storm," reads one. One ship's hull timber turned up centuries later in a dockworker's barge, still bearing a carved fish from its war days. There's a tiny image etched into it. Two figures, back to back, their hands raised, not in prayer, but in farewell. Around them, curling waves and a bird in flight. Whoever carved it wasn't trying to impress. They were trying to remember, trying to say goodbye. Imagine that. A mighty warship reborn as a humble grain hauler. Kind of poetic. Or humiliating, depending on your outlook. Ancient texts mention this quiet lament sung by the remaining crew as the vessel was pulled ashore for the last time. No wild drums, no horns, it's just a low, soft chant, sometimes accompanied by a single flute or the rattle of oars laid flat in rhythm, the kind of sound that sticks in your ribs long after it's gone. In one notable find, a ship's remnants bore signs of funerary oilless sticky resin applied to preserve the final remains. Deep, slow, in a language long dead. You don't need to understand the words, the melody says enough. These ships, carved and christened, scarred and saluted, found rest not in museums or scrolls, but in the hands and voices of those who knew them best. You and nearby. A few cracked amphorae filled with dried petals. The sawdust quiet returns, as gentle as mist on water. There's no more need to peer into shadows or chase meanings through cracked wood. The stories have settled. Who leaves flowers for a boat? It's the kind of people who think ships are more than tools. The kind who carve ducks for laughs, who burn stars into the floor, who whisper to the waves when they think no one hears. Another, born from cedar, died by salt. One dig turned up a set of 12 oar blades in a neat row, each one etched with a name. Maybe rowers, maybe deities. The journey's end is never the end, not really. These ships float in your mind now, adrift in dreams. There's no storm, no war, no clever carving to decode. Just the lull of waves and the knowledge that you've drifted through something few ever glimpse. The lives, laughs, and legacies etched not into stone, but into something as fragile as a timber hull. One or even bore the phrase, "He never missed the beat," which sounds like a compliment and a warning depending on your mood. On its edge, faint and hard to see, is a final carving, a spiral surrounded by waves. Several recovered flagship fragments show signs of their helmsman's perch being removed deliberately, often burned or buried. A few fringe scholars suggest the Carthaginians believed these seats absorbed the spirit of command, like a sponge of authority, and needed to be respectfully destroyed once the ship was retired. Carved like a secret, now glowing like a whisper. The quiet reverence, the humanness of it all. The idea that even the most forgotten things can be remembered, if someone just leans in and listens. Personally, I think someone just didn't want the new guy sitting where the old legend once did. At its center, barely etched a single dot. It's not ornate, it's not flashy. But it's repeated on several retired vessels, always in the same place. The tiller brace. Some scholars believe it was a soul, not meant to tether the ship's spirit for the long voyage into rest. Others think it's just a decorative flourish. But when you stand here in the hush and grain of this place, it feels sacred. You can't make this stuff up, it's poetry and sawdust. Historians still argue whether this practice was religious or cultural. Was it an offering to see gods, or just a way to honor the ship's service? Maybe both. After all, Carthaginian religion had more saltwater in it than most. They gave thanks to Melkart, to Balamon, to Ashtart of the waves. Some believe each vessel had a spirit, a kind of wooden soul, to just disassemble it casually. That'd be like tossing grandma's ashes in the recycling bin. And this belief might explain the strange burial markers found near some shipyards. In one dig site outside ancient Carthage's naval harbor, archaeologists discovered a long trench filled not with wreckage, but with sections of retired hulls, stacked and angled like coffins. Alongside them, pottery oil lamps, and in one case, a jar of raisins. A snack for the afterlife? Or just someone's forgotten lunch? We'll never know. You walk past a warped, sideways beam still charred from some forgotten fire. Some boats weren't sunk or buried. They were dismantled, ceremonially stripped of usable wood, and scattered into smaller civilian crafts, almost like reincarnation. You kneel beside a fragment once part of a merchant ship's prow. There's evidence that these farewells were more than symbolic. And it wasn't just the ships that were laid to rest. Some oarsies, especially those used by senior rowers, were also buried. What's even stranger, the captain's seats, and then there's this. Some ships, when sent into ceremonial retirement, were sung to sleep. You lean against one last timber, warmed faintly by the day's stored heat, and you imagine that song. It says, "We remember you." It says, "Thank you for carrying us." And maybe, just maybe, it says, "Sleep now." The sea is quiet. And now the story fades, not with a final battle or a splash of bronze, but with this gentle closing breath. Because you walked through their ribs, you traced their names. You found the duck and the goat and the soul spiral. And now they live in your memory too. You ease back now, letting the shapes of the ancient ships dissolve into a soft, comforting blur. The water has gone calm. Let your breathing match the imagined rhythm of oars long, steady strokes across glassy seas. You don't need to steer anymore. The lights in the shipyard dim, one by one, until only the soft memory of that final spiral remains. You might forget the details by morning, the exact angle of a ballista scar, the silly dancing donkey butt. Something will linger. So lean back now. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let your thoughts settle like sediment in a harbor. And with that final exhale, the tide carries you into sleep.